Listen closely. I'm about to tell you something they don't teach in those fluorescent-lit therapy offices, where hope comes packaged in 50-minute sessions. There's an old Czech proverb, or perhaps I dreamed it during a fever, that says the truest confession comes not from the mouth that speaks, but from the silence that follows when you stop listening. Picture this. A man sits across from his lover at dinner. The candles flicker like dying moths against crystal, and she's telling him again about her needs, her dreams, that promotion she deserves but won't pursue. He's heard this symphony before, each note predictable as rain on cobblestones. But tonight, something shifts. He doesn't lean in with practiced concern. He doesn't offer solutions wrapped in masculine certainty. He simply stops. Not cruelly, you understand. Not with the theatrical coldness of a man trying to punish. No. This is something far more dangerous. Authentic disinterest. The kind that emerges when you realize you've been dancing with your own projection, waltzing with a ghost you dressed in someone else's clothes. The ancient Stoics knew this secret, though they buried it beneath talk of virtue and duty. Marcus Aurelius, scribbling by candlelight while plague ravaged Rome, understood that love's greatest test isn't passion, it's indifference. Not the performed kind that begs for attention but like a street magician's trick, but the real thing. That terrifying moment when you discover you simply don't care. And here's where it gets interesting, where the velvet curtains part to reveal the grotesque machinery behind the stage. When you stop performing your half of the dance, when you cease being the reliable audience to her one-woman show, watch what happens. The masks begin to slip, first slowly, like melting wax, then all at once, like a dam bursting in spring. She'll cycle through responses like a pianist running scales. First, confusion, those wide eyes that ask, "Why aren't you playing your part?" Then anger, hot and quick as sulfur. Then, and this is where you must pay attention, comes the bargaining. She'll offer truths she's hoarded like winter grain. Confessions tumble out. The ex she still texts, the resentments she's nursed like sickly children, the ways she's been performing too. A 2024 study from the Journal of Interpersonal Relations found that 73% of relationship breakthroughs occurred not during intense dialogue, but in the spaces between, when one partner withdrew their emotional labor. The researchers called it therapeutic abandonment, though I prefer to think of it as architectural demolition. You stop being a load-bearing wall, and suddenly you can see which parts of the structure were actually standing on their own. There's a Sufi tale about a merchant who loved a parrot. Every day, he'd speak to it, feed it honeyed almonds, stroke its emerald feathers. The parrot sang beautifully until the day the merchant fell ill and couldn't tend to it. In his absence, the parrot revealed its true voice, a horrible, rusty screech that had been there all along, hidden beneath the songs it sang for treats. This is what Kierkegaard meant when he wrote about the anguish of freedom. That terrible moment when you realize every "I love you" might have been a transaction, every kiss a down payment on future security. The Danish philosopher, melancholic and brilliant, broke off his engagement to Regine Olsen not because he didn't love her, but because he loved her too much to keep performing the role of lover. He pushed her into silence, and in that void, they both discovered who they really were. But here's the twist, the bitter herb in this already acrid tea. Sometimes, in that silence, something genuine emerges. Like a photograph developing in darkroom chemicals, you might witness the first authentic moment of your entire relationship. When she stops performing for your validation, When you stop providing the emotional infrastructure she's been leaning on, you might, just might, meet each other for the first time. The cruelest joke? This truth, this revelation born from strategic withdrawal, often comes too late. By the time you've both dropped your masks, you've usually forgotten why you picked them up in the first place. You stand there, two strangers who've shared a bed for years, finally seeing each other clearly in the dying light of what you thought was love. So here's my question for you, whispered like a serpent's suggestion in Eden's last garden. What would happen if you stopped responding tonight? Not with anger, not with calculation, but with the simple, terrifying honesty of someone who's run out of energy to pretend. Would your lover reveal themselves, raw and real as a wound? Or would they simply disappear, a projection flickering out once the projector stops running? The answer might destroy everything you've built. But then again, and lean in close for this, what you've built might already be ruins, dressed in the costume of a home. Every flame you chase burns away another wing. There's a Japanese word, hikari goto, that doesn't exist, but should. It would mean the sickness of light, that fatal attraction to what illuminates and destroys in equal measure. I thought of it last Tuesday at 3 a.m., watching a moth throw itself against my desk lamp with the dedication of a medieval flagellant. Again and again, that soft body meeting hard glass, leaving tiny scales like ash from cremated dreams. Men are moths, not butterflies. Those get all the poetry. But moths, nocturnal, desperate, evolutionarily programmed to navigate by distant light, now confused by every artificial flame that promises warmth but delivers third-degree burns. Consider the modern dating app, that slot machine of dopamine hits where every swipe right is another flutter toward the electric bug zapper. A 2025 MIT study tracked the eye movements of men scrolling through profiles, their pupils dilated most not at beauty, but at signs of damage. The crooked smile that hints at past pain. The bio that mentions working on myself. The photos with that particular quality of loneliness that sophisticated algorithms can now detect with 89% accuracy. We hunt the broken because we recognize ourselves in their fractures. Like that Hemingway line about going bankrupt. Gradually, then suddenly, we move toward destruction in the same way. First, just a flutter closer to the interesting girl with daddy issues. Then suddenly, we're living in her chaos, paying her rent, trying to fix what was shattered before we were born. I knew a man once. Let's call him Andreas, because every cautionary tale needs a name that sounds like a sigh. Andreas collected wounded women like some men collect vintage wines. Each one was going to be different. The ballet dancer with the eating disorder, he'd teach her to love her body. The lawyer with the cocaine habit, he'd be her stability. The artist who hadn't painted in 3 years, he'd be her muse. You can guess how each story ended. Not in flames, that would be too cinematic. They ended in ash, the quiet gray kind that accumulates in corners and under fingernails. Andreas would emerge from each relationship a little more translucent, like paper held up to light, until I swear you could see through him on sunny days. Schopenhauer wrote that we're all porcupines in winter, driven together by cold, driven apart by quills. But he missed the darker truth. Some of us are addicted to the puncture wounds. We've confused love with recovery room visits, passion with emergency surgery. The Gothic cathedrals of medieval Europe were built on the bones of saints, literally, crypts and reliquaries forming the foundation. Every prayer ascending to heaven stood on a foundation of death. This is what we're doing with our relationships, building monuments to healing on ground that's fundamentally cursed. There's a chemical explanation, of course. Trauma bonding releases the same cocktail of neurotransmitters as cocaine, dopamine, norepinephrine, that sweet serotonin drop that makes everything feel significant. A UCLA study from 2024 found that men who grew up in chaotic households showed 340% more attraction to partners displaying emotional volatility markers. We're not choosing love. We're choosing the familiar burn of childhood translated into adult bedrooms. But here's where it gets exquisitely perverse. The wounded moth develops thicker wings. Each burn creates scar tissue, and scar tissue doesn't feel pain the same way virgin skin does. So we chase bigger flames, more dangerous women, higher voltages of dysfunction. The Russian novelist with the pill problem. The married professor who cries after Zaphanoptus. The bartender who keeps a loaded gun in her nightstand and calls you her safe person. You want to know the truth that lives in the space between heartbeats? The women aren't the flame. You are. You're burning yourself on your own reflection, using their chaos as a mirror for your own internal immolation. Every unstable woman you've tried to save was just you in a dress. You with different pronouns. You with painted nails scratching at the same essential wound. The Buddhists have a meditation where you imagine yourself as already dead, your body decomposing, feeding worms and enriching soil. They say it brings peace. But I'll tell you what they don't mention in those mindfulness apps. Sometimes, when you're lying next to another broken person at 4 a.m., both of you pretending to sleep, both of you knowing this is killing you. Sometimes you realize you've been dead for years. You're just a ghost, haunting other ghosts, playing out the same scene night after night in a theater where the audience left long ago. The moth doesn't know it's dying. Evolution never programmed it to recognize artificial light as different from the moon. Its entire navigation system, millions of years in the making, betrayed by Edison's invention. This is you, evolutionary programming intact, flying toward every beautiful disaster because your Paleolithic brain can't distinguish between intensity and intimacy. So here's my question, delivered with the tenderness of a scalpel. When did you decide that love had to hurt to be real? Which childhood moment crystallized into this addiction to emergency? And more importantly, look at me now. What would happen if you turned off the light? Would you discover you could navigate by stars instead of flames? Or would you realize, and this is the fear that keeps you burning, that in the darkness, without the pain to guide you, you have no idea where you're going? Maybe that's the beginning of healing. Or maybe it's just another pretty lie we tell ourselves while reaching for the next beautiful flame. Solitude is the only honest mirror. Everything else is performance. In 1934, a Russian Orthodox monk named Father Seraphim sealed himself inside a cave on Mount Athos. The other monks would lower bread and water through a hole once a week. He stayed there for 7 years. When they finally opened the cave, thinking him dead, they found him sitting in lotus position, smiling, surrounded by thousands of pages of the most profound theological poetry ever written. He'd grown transparent, they said, like looking at light through honey. He refused to explain what happened in that cave. He burned all the pages. Then he walked into the sea. I think about Father Seraphim when I see men posting gym selfies at 5 a.m., hashtagging their loneliness as grinding, their isolation as focusing on myself, kings. They're so close to the truth it hurts, like watching someone dig for treasure and stop 3 inches from gold. Here's what nobody tells you about voluntary solitude. It's not empty. It's so full it might split you open like overripe fruit. When you stop performing your life for an audience, real or imagined, Something ancient and terrible starts to grow in that space. The Greeks called it autarkeia, self-sufficiency, but they were too rational to describe what it really feels like. It's more like becoming pregnant with yourself. A Stanford study on voluntary social isolation found something the researchers didn't expect and tried to bury in footnotes. Men who spent 6 months completely alone showed increased testosterone, improved cognitive function, and, here's the kicker, dramatically increased empathy scores. Not despite the isolation, but because of it. When you stop curating yourself for others, you finally meet who you actually are. And that person, that stranger you've been avoiding your whole life, might actually be worth knowing. But let me tell you about the horror first, because that's what you'll meet before the gold. Week 1 of real solitude, not loneliness, which is just performed solitude with an audience of your own self-pity, feels like detox. Your hands reach for your phone like a phantom limb. You'll catch yourself having conversations with people who aren't there, explaining yourself to invisible judges. You'll realize, with the kind of clarity that makes you want to drink, that 90% of your thoughts are just rehearsals for conversations that will never happen. Week 2, the voices start. Not psychotic breaks, something worse. You'll hear every woman who ever left you explaining why, in perfect detail, at 3 a.m. Your father's disappointment, your mother's subtle sighs, that teacher who said you had potential in a way that meant you'd never reach it. The Greek chorus of your failures, singing in perfect harmony. Week 3. If you make it to week 3 without running back to the nearest warm body or whiskey bottle, something breaks. Not you. The performance of you, the character you've been playing since kindergarten, finally runs out of script. And in that terrifying silence, something else starts speaking. Nietzsche went mad in Turin, hugging a horse being whipped, weeping uncontrollably. But before that, he spent 10 years alone in Swiss Alpine boarding houses, writing books nobody read, walking 8 hours a day, talking only to his landlady about the weather. In that decade of solitude, he discovered something so dangerous that civilization is still trying to misunderstand it. The Übermensch isn't someone who dominates others. It's someone who no longer needs others to confirm they exist. There's a Tibetan practice called Gompa, sitting in darkness until you can see, not metaphorically, literally. After weeks in pitch black, practitioners report seeing lights, mandalas, entire universes spawning from the void. Scientists say it's just the visual cortex creating patterns from nothing. But the monks smile when they hear this explanation, the way you smile when a child explains where babies come from. The modern man pays $200 an hour for therapy to discover what any hermit could tell him for free. You're not depressed because you're alone. You're depressed because you're never alone. Even in an empty room, you're performing for the internalized audience of everyone who ever judged you. You're a one-man show playing to empty seats, wondering why you feel exhausted. But here's the secret that Father Seraphim knew, that made him burn those pages. In true solitude, you discover you're not one person, but thousands. Every version of yourself you've ever been or could be exists simultaneously. The boy who wanted to be an astronaut, the teenager who wrote terrible poetry, the man who almost called off his wedding, the elder you'll become if you're lucky. They're all there, waiting in the silence, ready to teach you things that no lover, friend, or father ever could. A Harvard neuroscientist recently discovered that extended solitude literally rewires the brain. The default mode network, usually scattered, managing social anxieties and future planning, consolidates into something resembling the brain patterns of lifelong meditators. You don't become antisocial, you become pre-social. returning to the consciousness you had before you learned you were supposed to be someone. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke spent a winter alone in a castle, writing letters to a young poet he'd never met. In one, he said, "Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act, just once, with beauty and courage." He didn't mention that you can only see the dragons clearly when there's no one else around to tell you they're windmills. So here's my challenge, my dare, my invitation to the dance of stillness. Can you spend 1 week, just 7 days, without explaining yourself to anyone? Without posting, texting, or narrating your life? Without the drug of other people's validation? I'm not talking about loneliness. That's just isolation with self-pity as your companion. I mean real solitude. You and the 1,000 versions of yourself finally having the conversation you've been avoiding since birth. What would you discover in that silence? Who would you become if no one was watching? The answer might be so beautiful it breaks you, or so ordinary it heals you. Either way, it will be yours. The first thing that's truly yours since you learned to perform yourself for others' applause. The softer the prison, the stronger the bars. Last night, I watched a documentary about lobsters. Not metaphorically, actual lobsters. In the 1800s, they were prison food, so abundant that Massachusetts passed laws limiting how often you could feed them to inmates. It was considered cruel. Now we pay $40 for one at restaurants where the waiter explains its provenance like a wine's terroir. The lobster didn't change. We did. We transformed garbage into luxury by forgetting it was garbage. This is your life. This is all our lives. Comfort repackaged as success, spiritual death marketed as work-life balance. There's a Germanic folktale about a village that discovers a spring of warm, sweet water. Perfect temperature, perfect taste. The villagers stop traveling to the distant well. They grow fat, happy, sedentary. Their children are born softer, smaller. After 3 generations, they can't remember why their ancestors built such thick walls around the village, so they tear them down for building material. The wolves, who've been waiting, watching, walk in like they own the place. Because they do. You're living in that village. Your apartment with its optimal temperature control. Your subscription services that deliver everything before you know you want it. Your algorithm-curated playlist that never challenges, never surprises, just feeds you variations of what you already like until your taste becomes a snake eating its own tail. The philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls it the tiredness society. We're not oppressed by dictators but by comfort, not broken by torture but by convenience. A 2024 Oxford study found that men with the highest comfort index, measured by conveniences, automated services, and friction reduction technologies, showed the highest rates of existential depression. The researchers were baffled. How could having everything lead to feeling nothing? I'll tell you how. Picture a man. Let's call him Thomas, because every Thomas I've known has been comfortable and miserable. Thomas makes $120,000 a year at a job that requires maybe 3 hours of actual thought per day. He has a girlfriend who's pleasant enough, attractive enough, who never fights because she's on SSRIs that flatten her affect to the emotional range of a PBS documentary. His apartment has blackout curtains, white noise machine, air purifier, a sensory deprivation tank he pays $3,000 a month to live in. Thomas exercises on a Peloton, virtual instructor cheering him on with pre-recorded enthusiasm. Orders meal prep delivered in containers that stack perfectly in his minimalist refrigerator. His therapist, who he sees via app, tells him he's doing the work, Because he journals 3 gratitudes every morning. Thomas is dying, not physically. His Apple Watch assures him his metrics are optimal. He's dying the way fruit dies in those wax displays at furniture stores, maintaining perfect form while the inside rots to powder. Kierkegaard wrote about this in The Sickness unto Death, not the death of the body, but the death of the self, murdered by comfort, buried in convenience. The Danish philosopher, himself too comfortable and tortured by it, knew that despair comes not from lacking, but from having without earning, consuming without creating, existing without resisting. Ancient Spartan boys were sent into the wilderness with nothing but a cloak. Most cultures had initiation rites that required suffering, transformation through trial. We have what? College debt? That's not a trial. It's a subscription service for misery. Your grandfather's war was horror, but at least it was real. Your war is with your inbox, your attention span, your slowly softening body that hasn't known real hunger, real cold, real anything. There's a researcher in Norway who studies what he calls voluntary adversity. He has CEOs and hedge fund managers pay him $10,000 to abandon them in the Arctic with minimal supplies. Half quit within 2 days. The ones who make it through the week report the same thing. For the first time in decades, they felt real. Not happy, real. The difference between those words is the difference between morphine and surgery. The Stoics had a practice called premeditatio malorum, imagining loss, poverty, death. Modern therapy says this is catastrophizing. Anxiety needs medication. But Marcus Aurelius, running an empire while plague killed his children, knew better. You need to touch death occasionally to remember you're alive. Here's what comfort does. The velvet strangler. It removes all resistance. And resistance is what creates strength. Every mythology knows this. The hero must suffer to become heroic. But you've optimized away every inconvenience, smoothed every rough edge, until you're sliding through life on a surface so frictionless you can't get purchase to push off in any direction. A 2025 Berkeley study on comfort addiction found that the brain processes convenience the same way it processes opioids, diminishing returns requiring ever higher doses. Your great-grandfather was satisfied with a roof that didn't leak. You're anxious because your Wi-Fi takes 3 seconds to load. The Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, comfortable in his Bollingen Tower, would regularly fast, sleep on stone, work with his hands until they bled. He called it confronting the shadow, but it was simpler than that. He was staying dangerous in a world trying to make him safe. So here's my question, delivered with the care of someone placing a scorpion in your shoe. What was the last thing you did that genuinely scared you? Not roller coaster scared, not horror movie scared, existentially scared. When did you last risk real failure, real rejection, real loss? If you can't remember, you're already dead. You're a ghost haunting a comfortable life, wondering why you can't feel the warmth. The solution isn't to burn it all down. That's just another form of comfort, the comfort of destruction. It's to introduce calculated suffering. Cold showers aren't enough. That's just discomfort porn. I mean real stakes. Start a business that might fail. Have a conversation that might end a relationship. Create something that might be terrible. Touch the electric fence of existence. Remember what it feels like to be shocked into presence. Otherwise, you'll die in that velvet noose, so soft you never noticed it tightening, so comfortable you forgot you were choking. Strip away enough masks, and you'll find there's no face underneath, just space. In 1973, a Japanese artist named Tei Ching-hsie locked himself in a wooden cage for 1 year. No talking, no reading, no writing. A friend brought food once a day, emptied waste. That's it. When asked why, he said, "I wasn't trying to become anything. I was trying to unbecome everything." He emerged unable to speak properly for 3 months, but his eyes, witnesses said his eyes looked like windows that had been cleaned for the first time, revealing there had never been glass there at all. This is the last truth, the one that makes all the others seem like children's games. There is no authentic self waiting to be discovered. The entire self-help industrial complex, the therapy sessions, the ayahuasca retreats in Peru, they're all selling you a treasure map to a treasure that doesn't exist. You're not finding yourself. You're inventing yourself. And worse, or better, depending on your tolerance for vertigo, you're inventing the thing that's doing the inventing. A 2025 neuroscience study from MIT tried to locate the self in the brain. They used every scanner, every test, mapped every neural pathway. Know what they found? Nothing. Or rather, everything. The self is a constantly shifting coalition of neural networks, changing based on context, memory, expectation. You're not a noun, you're a verb. Not a being, but a becoming. And even that becoming is just a story you're telling yourself about the electricity in your skull. The Buddhists have been laughing about this for 1,500 years. Anatta, no self. But the West turned it into find your true self because we can't sell emptiness. We need products, programs, identities to purchase and perform. Here's what happened. Somewhere around age 5, you started building a character based on what got you fed, loved, not abandoned. Smart boy, strong boy, funny boy, sensitive boy. You tried on these costumes until one fit well enough to survive childhood. Then you forgot it was a costume. You became method actors who never broke character, even alone, even in our dreams. But sometimes, usually at 3 a.m., usually after too much whiskey or too much truth, the costume tears. And through that rip, you see something terrifying. Nothing. Just space. Endless, empty space where you thought there was substance. Nietzsche knew this. That's what God is dead really meant. Not that the deity died, but that the entire framework of fixed identity, eternal self, unchanging essence, was a fiction. And if God is a fiction, and God made you in His image, what does that make you? I knew a man, brilliant mathematician, ugly as a toad's nightmare, who had a psychotic break at 37. Not from drugs or trauma, from thinking too clearly. He realized with mathematical precision that every single thing he thought of as himself was just a pattern of reactions. His humor, defense mechanism, his kindness, childhood programming, his love of jazz, random neural wiring. He spent 6 months in a psychiatric ward, not because he was wrong, but because he was right. They stabilized him with medication that made him forget what he'd seen. He thanks them for it. The ancient Gnostics believed the material world was a prison built by a false god, and the only escape was to realize you were never really here. They were hunted, burned, their texts destroyed. Not because they were wrong, because they were on to something that would collapse the entire social order if widely understood. Every identity you claim is a prison. Man, professional, lover, rebel, loner. Even someone who doesn't believe in identity is an identity. You're like that drawing by Escher, hands drawing hands drawing hands. Except you're the paper, the pencil, and the optical illusion simultaneously. A Harvard philosopher recently argued that consciousness itself might be an illusion, a story the brain tells itself to make sense of its own complexity. The academic community destroyed him, not with counter-arguments, but with silence. Some truths are too true for publication. So what do you do with this knowledge? How do you live knowing you're a fiction writing itself? First, you stop trying to find yourself. You're not lost. You're not even a you that could be lost. You're a process, like fire, not the wood, not the flame, but the burning itself. Second, you realize this is freedom. If you're a fiction, you can be rewritten, not into your authentic self, that's just another costume, but into whatever the moment requires. Tender with children, ruthless in business, silent in nature. Not because you're multifaceted, but because you're nothing, and nothing can take any shape. The Zen master Huang Po said, "The foolish reject what they see, not what they think. The wise reject what they think, not what they see. But the truly awakened reject both seeing and thinking, and rest in the space between." There's a practice in Tibetan Buddhism called sky burial. They leave corpses on mountaintops for vultures to consume. Nothing wasted, nothing preserved. This is what you need to do with your identity. Let it be picked clean until only space remains. But here's the cosmic joke, the final paradox that makes everything else look like foreplay. In that space, in that nothing, something else appears. Not a new self, something stranger. Call it presence, call it awareness, call it Tuesday. It doesn't care what you call it. It was there before you were born. It'll be there after you die. And it's reading these words right now. Amused that you think you're the one reading. So here's my final question. My last serpent's whisper. My invitation to the void. Who would you be if you stopped trying to be anyone? What would remain if you let every identity, every story, every precious notion of yourself burn like Father Seraphim's pages? Would you disappear? Or would you finally appear, not as a self, but as the space in which all selves arise and dissolve, like clouds in an empty sky that was never really empty, just too vast for clouds to matter? The answer isn't in these words. It's in the silence after you finish reading, in that pause before you return to being whoever you think you are. Listen to it. That silence knows your real name. The one that can't be spoken because it's not a name at all. It's just the sound of space, being itself, pretending to be you for a while. For the sheer strange joy of forgetting it's infinite.